I was 66 the night my name finally stopped meaning invoices and payroll. For 40 years I'd been the guy who smelled like cedar and machine oil, the widower who kept his ring on and his head down, building a chain of woodshops into a real furniture company. I missed dinners, little league school plays, told myself someday I'd make it up to my boy. When the wire hit, $50 million for everything I'd built, I thought maybe someday had finally shown up. So I booked a table where the napkins feel like clouds and the silverware has more weight than your conscience. Daniel arrived in a navy blazer he never would have worn as a kid. He hugged me a little too fast, the way people do when they're thinking about something else. Clara gave me a smile that would photograph well. "Dad," he said, clapping my shoulder, "you did it." The host sat us beneath a chandelier that looked like a patient galaxy. A string quartet hummed from a hidden corner. It felt like the kind of place where mistakes whispered instead of shouted. "Let's celebrate right," Daniel said, lifting the wine list like he was auditioning to be rich. "You deserve it." Clara squeezed my hand. "Your wife would be proud," she said. I pictured Anne at our first shop, the day we painted the front door robin's egg blue and swore we'd keep it that way. She would have told me to order something I can't pronounce. I joked, and the table laughed the way people laugh when they're all trying to be the version of themselves that tips well. Truth is, I don't drink much anymore. Blood pressure, a doctor with stern eyebrows, age has a way of handing out rules. I asked for a splash of red, mostly for the color. We clinked glasses. Daniel's smile had an extra watt to it, the kind that lights up a showroom but doesn't warm a room. I told him about the sale, the relief, the way walking through the plant that morning felt like saying goodbye to a stubborn friend. He nodded at the parts where the numbers lived and blinked past the parts about the people. My phone buzzed, my lawyer, Richard. Final signatures, last-minute language, the stuff that makes a deal real. 2 minutes, I told Daniel, pushing my chair back. Don't let them take the bread. He made a joke about charging me for every slice and waved me off. The hallway to the lobby smelled like lemon polish and old wood, the kind of scent that remembers things you've forgotten. Richard confirmed the wire, told me I could breathe. I said I'd try. When I turned to head back, a kid in a server's vest was waiting like he'd run there. "Sir," he said, voice low enough to respect the carpet. He couldn't have been more than 23. Brown eyes, nervous hands. Miguel, his name tag read, and it tilted slightly like it hadn't meant to have this conversation. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Miller, but please don't drink your wine." He swallowed. "Something's wrong with it." For a second, I didn't understand the sentence. It floated in the air like a balloon that didn't want to land. "What do you mean?" I asked. He glanced over my shoulder, then back to me. "When you stepped away, I was clearing the next table," he said. "I saw your son swap your glass. He poured something in. It dissolved." He winced, like saying it hurt his teeth. "I know how that sounds. I just couldn't not tell you. There's a moment when a table saw hits a nail that the whole shop goes quiet inside you. That's how it felt, not panic, a pause shaped like disbelief." I looked past him toward the dining room, the soft light, the orbiting waiters, my son leaning toward his wife, whispering with the same mouth that once asked me how to tie a tie. I heard Anne in my head, "Breathe, Ed, ask the next right question." "Are you sure?" I said. Miguel nodded once. "I don't get involved," he said, and the way he said it told me he has had reasons not to. "But I've seen things. My dad got sick from a bad bottle when I was a kid. I pay attention now." Something slid in my chest, heavy and old. A memory I hadn't invited. Daniel at 10 in faded pajamas, standing in the doorway of my shop while the late shift sang metal against metal. "Dad, don't work tonight," he'd said, 3 teeth missing from that brave little grin. "Just eat dinner with me, please." I told him I had deadlines, promised him Saturday pancakes, kissed his head and went back to sanding. There are moments you swear you'll circle back to, some you never do. I put a hand on Miguel's shoulder. It felt like a father's hand finding a stranger and recognizing a son anyway. "Thank you," I said. "Can you do one thing for me?" He nodded. I asked him to bring a fresh bottle, any excuse that didn't start a fire, and if he could, tuck my original glass somewhere safe like it might matter later. He took a breath and said he could. People underestimate how brave, quiet kindness can be. I walked back into the dining room with my body still in its suit and my mind somewhere time didn't know. Daniel looked up with a grin that had learned my smile and sanded off the edges. "Everything good?" he asked. "They want my autograph," I said. He laughed too loud. Clara's eyes flicked to my glass the way a cat watches a door. Miguel appeared with a new bottle, apologized for the mix-up he invented, and poured us all a fresh start. I lifted the glass and didn't drink. We talked like families do when they are circling whatever they came to say. Daniel asked about numbers. Clara asked about travel, about beaches with names you whisper. I answered about people, how I might set up scholarships, a vocational center, something named for Anne so her name could keep doing what she did, make hard days softer. Daniel's jaw ticked. "That's generous," he said, and generous sounded like a word that owed him money. The bread was warm. The quartet slid into something that pretends not to be sad. I watched my son over the rim of a story I'd been telling myself for decades. The boy who once argued for family dinner had become a man who checked the entrances. And me. I was the father finally showing up to the table, late enough to find a different kind of hunger waiting. I set my glass down and felt the room the way carpenters feel a floor. What creaks, what carries, what might give. If you're still here with me, listening to an old man trying to make sense of a beautiful, broken night, stick around. I'll tell you what I did next. And if you've ever had a moment where the people you love weren't who you thought they were, tell me where you're watching from. Maybe we're not as alone at these tables as we think. Edward slid back into his chair, and for a split second everything looked normal, until his eyes fell on the bottom of his wine glass. There was something cloudy swirling there, faint, like a dusting of chalk that hadn't mixed in all the way. His gut tightened. "Dad," Daniel said, lifting his glass with a grin stretched too wide, "here's to $50 million. His voice carried, too polished, almost rehearsed. Clara leaned in close, her smile all sweetness, but when she poured a little more wine into his glass, Edward noticed her hand tremble. Not much, just enough for someone who's paying attention. Edward didn't say a word. He just reached for the wrong glass on purpose, sliding the one in front of him toward Clara as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Switch with me, honey," he said with a soft chuckle. "You poured yourself short." Then he signaled for a fresh bottle from the waiter. Miguel returned, carrying the new wine. While Daniel was busy raising his glass again and Clara was laughing at something that didn't sound funny, Miguel brushed past Edward's chair and in one smooth motion slipped the suspicious glass into a clear plastic sleeve. He didn't say a word, but when he straightened up, his eyes met Edward's. He gave the faintest nod, just enough to say, "You were right to worry." Edward's pulse thudded in his ears. He leaned back, smiling like he was still enjoying his son's company, but his mind was miles away. The air felt colder, heavier. What he didn't know yet was Miguel's story. That kid wasn't just some waiter doing his job. Years ago, Miguel's father had died from a bottle of bad liquor, cheap. fake stuff someone had sold as the real thing. Miguel was 12 when he watched the strongest man in his life stumble, choke, and never get back up. From that night on, he swore he'd never look away when someone's life was in danger. He knew what it was to lose a father to something slipped into a drink. And now, here he was, standing in a starched vest and apron, quietly making sure another man didn't suffer the same fate. Edward took a slow breath and studied his son's face across the table. The boy who once begged, "Dad, please don't work late tonight, just eat with me," was now a man whose toast rang hollow. The contrast burned. He felt like he was staring at two Daniels at once, the child he raised and the stranger who might be planning his death. He lifted his glass but didn't drink. Instead, he watched his son over the rim, his smile steady, his heart breaking in silence. Richard's office always smelled faintly of leather and old books, the kind of place where secrets felt safe. Edward sat there staring at the sealed plastic bag with the wine glass inside. His old friend turned it slowly under the light, then slid a folder across the desk. "Lab rushed it for me," Richard said. "Digitalis, strong enough to stop your heart in minutes." Edward let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "So it wasn't just my eyes playing tricks on me." Richard shook his head. "Given your condition, high blood pressure, enlarged heart, one sip could have finished you." The words hit like a slow hammer. Edward looked down at his hands, scarred from years of sawdust and machines, and thought how ridiculous it was that after 6 decades of grinding through work, the thing that could have killed him was sitting pretty in a crystal glass. Richard wasn't done. "I also had someone dig into Daniel and Clara's finances." He opened another file. Maxed out credit cards. Their mortgage is 3 months behind. Investments that tanked. They're drowning, Ed. And when people are drowning, they'll climb on top of anybody just to keep their heads above water. Edward felt his throat go dry. "My own son," he whispered. 2 nights later, Richard called him back in. "You need to hear this," he said, pressing play on a recorder. The voices came through, muffled but sharp enough to cut. Daniel's voice, low and bitter. "He's nothing but a walking wallet. The minute he's gone, everything is ours." There was silence after the words, then Clara's nervous laugh, the kind that sounds like it knows too much. Edward froze, the veins in his hand rising as his fist closed tight, so tight his nails broke the skin of his palm. He didn't even notice until he felt the sting of blood. And just like that, a memory blindsided him. Daniel, 19 years old, shoulders slumped, face buried in his hands after the rejection letter from his dream school. "I'm a failure, Dad," he'd sobbed. Edward had pulled him in, kissed the top of his head, whispered, "Son, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be decent. Live honest, live kind. I'll handle the rest." That was the boy he raised. That was the promise he made. Now, sitting in the dim glow of his friend's office, Edward realized that boy was gone, replaced by a man who could look at his father and see nothing but dollar signs. And the weight of that truth, heavier than any hammer, sharper than any saw, settled on his chest like stone. Richard's office wasn't made for moments like this. It was too polished, too calm. The shelves lined with legal books, the quiet hum of an old clock in the corner. But Edward knew that no courtroom could carry the weight of what was about to happen. He stood by the window, arms crossed, waiting for the door to open. Daniel walked in first, head high, jacket slung over his shoulder like he owned the place. Clara followed half a step behind, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her face arranged into something between worry and sweetness. "Dad," Daniel said, voice casual. "What's going on? Why so urgent?" Edward didn't answer. He waited until they sat down, then he placed the evidence on the table between them. A clear plastic bag containing the wine glass, the residue still visible at the bottom. Next to it, the lab report. Neither of them moved at first. Then Daniel leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What is this supposed to be?" Edward's voice was steady. "That's the glass you handed me 2 nights ago. It was tested, came back positive for digitalis." He let the words sink in, enough to kill me. Clara gasped, too sharp, too rehearsed. Daniel blinked, then gave a short laugh, shaking his head. "You can't be serious, Dad, come on, this is insane." Edward didn't flinch. "Is it?" For a moment, the room went quiet except for the tick of the clock. Then Daniel slammed his hand on the desk. "You're accusing your own son. After everything I've done, you think I'd try to poison you. You never trusted me. You never loved me. You loved your damn company, your machines, your wood and nails. That was your real family, not me." The anger rolled off him hot and fast, but Edward just stared. "Is that what you believe?" Clara reached for Daniel's arm, her voice breaking in all the right places. "Edward, please, he didn't mean it. This is a misunderstanding. Daniel loves you, we both do." Her eyes glistened, a perfect show, but when she turned away too quickly, Edward caught the flicker of guilt. Richard slid the lab report closer to them, the numbers black and unforgiving. "This isn't a misunderstanding, it's science." Clara's facade cracked, her shoulders slumped. She whispered, "We were desperate." Then she covered her mouth, as if she'd said too much. Edward leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "Desperate? You think desperation excuses murder? I built this life with my bare hands. I raised you under this roof, Daniel. Every nail in that house, every plank of wood I put there. And you were ready to end me just to put your name on a deed." Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes darting away. He had no words this time. The air grew heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Clara stared at the floor, tears sliding down her cheek, real or fake. Edward couldn't tell anymore. Daniel's face hardened into stone, the anger draining into something colder. Edward stood, his voice breaking the silence. "I could take this to the police right now. I should. But I wanted to look you in the eye first. I wanted to hear if there was anything left of the boy I raised, the boy who once begged me not to work late because he just wanted to eat dinner with his dad." Daniel didn't answer. His silence was louder than any confession. The clock ticked again, a hollow sound in the stillness. And in that moment, Edward knew. Something in their family had died long before the poison ever touched his glass. Edward didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet in Richard's office carried more weight than shouting ever could. He looked at his son and daughter-in-law like a man staring at strangers in familiar skin. Then he pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk. "You've got 2 choices," he said, his tone flat, like he was reading off an invoice. "1, I hand this evidence to the police. Poisoning, attempted murder, you'll be wearing orange for a long time. Or 2, you sign this confession. You admit what you tried to do and you walk out of my life for good. No money, no property, no more dinners, no more calls. You disappear." Daniel's face drained, the anger replaced by something almost childlike panic. "Dad, you can't." "I can," Edward cut him off. "And I will." Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the pen. Her mascara had started to smudge, and for once her tears didn't look rehearsed. She scribbled her name, the ink bleeding slightly on the page. Daniel stared at the paper like it was a coffin. "You'd really throw away your own son?" he asked, his voice breaking. Edward leaned forward, his eyes hard. "No. You threw yourself away the minute you decided my death was worth more than my life." He pointed at the paper. "Sign it, or I make the call right now." The silence stretched, and then with a shaking hand, Daniel bent over and signed his name. The sound of the pen scratching felt final, like a nail driven into wood. Edward picked up the paper, folded it neatly, and slipped it into his jacket. His next words came out colder than he thought possible. "From this moment on, I don't have a son." Daniel flinched like he'd been struck, but Edward didn't look at him again. He stood, turned his back, and let Richard usher them toward the door. Clara sobbed softly. Daniel muttered something under his breath, but Edward didn't catch it. Or maybe he didn't want to. When the door closed, Edward stayed standing for a long time, his hands pressed against the edge of the desk. The room felt bigger without them in it, but emptier too. Finally, he sat down and his eyes fell on the picture frame on the shelf, an old photo Richard had kept from years back. It showed Edward's late wife, Anne, holding a cake with too many candles. Daniel, maybe 10 years old, sat in Edward's lap, frosting smeared on his cheek, laughing like the world was simple. Back then, the company was nothing more than a shop, and the house still smelled of sawdust and coffee. Back then, family meant something. Edward picked up the frame and held it close. His throat tightened, but no tears came. Just a dull ache, the kind you carry when you realize the story you spent decades writing has burned down to ashes. He whispered into the empty room, almost to Anne, almost to himself. We gave him everything, and still it wasn't enough. Then he set the photo back down, squared his shoulders, and sat alone in the silence. For the first time in his life, he felt both free and hollow, like a man who had won a war but lost the only thing that ever made him fight. It was a couple of weeks after that brutal showdown in Richard's office when life surprised me in a way I never could have imagined. I was at a small community event for the scholarship program my foundation funded, the kind of gathering where students share their dreams and I get to see firsthand what the money is really doing. That's when I met her, Sophie. 24 years old, bright-eyed, a medical research student with her whole life ahead of her. She was there to thank me for the scholarship that kept her studies afloat. She spoke with a quiet confidence, but there was something in her face, something in the way she tilted her head that made me pause. It was familiar, though I couldn't place why. Later, when most of the crowd had gone, she asked if we could talk privately. We sat down at a little wooden bench outside, the evening breeze carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass. Her voice trembled at first. "Mr. Miller, there's something you should know. I didn't want to tell you tonight, but I can't keep it to myself." She took a deep breath, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I'm not just a scholarship student, I'm your granddaughter." I froze, my chest tightened. For a second I thought I'd misheard, but then she went on. "I'm Daniel's daughter. He was 19 when I was born, he left. My mother gave me up for adoption. A good family raised me and I'll always be grateful for them, but I found out the truth a few years ago." I stared at her, stunned, my world spinning in circles. My son, the same son who had just tried to poison me for money, had a daughter he abandoned. And she was sitting here in front of me, eyes steady, waiting for my response. And in those eyes I saw Anne, my late wife. Sophie had the same soft gaze, the same little spark when she smiled. It was like Anne had stepped into the moment, reminding me that life still held pieces of beauty, even buried under so much pain. I didn't know what to say. Words felt too small. All I managed was a whisper, "Your family." From that night on, Sophie and I began to see each other more often. Nothing fancy. Just small moments, coffee at the kitchen table, walks around the old neighborhood. One evening she insisted on cooking dinner at my place. "I'm not much of a cook," she warned with a grin, "but I'll try." We stood side by side in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, pots clattering like music. She clumsily sliced a carrot into uneven chunks, then laughed at herself. Guess I won't be winning any chef awards. I couldn't help it, I laughed too. A deep, real laugh I hadn't heard come out of my own mouth in years. And then, without warning, tears welled in my eyes. Not from sadness, but from something softer. Relief, maybe. Hope. The sound of her laughter filled the house, bouncing off walls that had been silent for far too long. For the first time since Anne's passing and since Daniel's betrayal, the kitchen felt alive again. It wasn't money or success or even revenge that gave me this feeling. It was family, unexpected, fragile, but real. As we sat down to eat our lopsided meal, Sophie looked at me and said, "I don't need anything from you except your time. I just want to know my grandfather." I swallowed hard, my fork heavy in my hand. "You already do," I told her, and I meant it. In that simple, imperfect dinner, I realized something powerful. Life had taken my son from me, but it had handed me back a granddaughter. Not in the way I ever planned, but maybe in the way I needed most. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the flicker of peace stirring in my chest. Edward could have spent the rest of his life bitter. He had every right to. His own son had tried to poison him, the family name he built nearly destroyed by greed. But instead of letting that betrayal rot him from the inside out, he chose a different path. With Sophie by his side, he poured his energy into something new. Her passion for cardiology lit a spark in him he thought had gone out forever. "If we can save even one person from what your grandmother went through," he told her, "then this money won't just be numbers in a bank, it'll be life." So, he funded her research project, giving her the chance to push forward a breakthrough that could help countless families. It wasn't just about medicine, it was about redemption. About giving Sophie the foundation her father never cared to provide. At the same time, Edward broke ground on something even closer to his heart. A vocational training center for orphaned kids named after Anne, his late wife. He pictured her smile on the day he unveiled the sign. The Ann Miller Center for Hope. A place where children without parents could find skills, direction, and most of all, belonging. For decades, he had built furniture with his hands. Now he was building futures. And yet, even while he built these new chapters, he knew there were old debts lingering in the shadows. Daniel and Clara had dug themselves into holes so deep that dangerous people were bound to come knocking. Edward made sure those debts were paid off, not for their sake, but for his own peace of mind. He didn't want their mess dragging back to Sophie or staining Anne's name. He cleared the slate quietly without ever picking up the phone or writing his son's name again. It wasn't forgiveness, it was closure. Through it all, Edward discovered something unexpected. Betrayal doesn't have to end with hate. It doesn't have to end in courtrooms or revenge or headlines. Sometimes, the real answer is to take the shards of what was broken and build something new out of them. The poison that nearly killed him became the very fire that pushed him to create a legacy. He used to think his story ended the night he caught Daniel's true face. But standing beside Sophie in a lab buzzing with possibility, and watching children hammer nails into wood at the training center, Edward realized that wasn't the end at all. It was just the beginning of something bigger, something that would outlast him. And in quiet moments when he sat on the porch at sunset, Edward would whisper to Anne's memory, "We turned the pain into something good, love. We did it." Because in the end, betrayal didn't get the last word. Legacy did. A year later, the grounds of the Ann Miller Center for Hope were alive with the sound of children. Little feet pattered across the courtyard, their laughter ringing out as they chased each other under the spring sun. The walls that had once been blueprints were now painted bright, and the training rooms buzzed with the voices of kids learning skills that might change the course of their lives. Edward stood near the entrance, watching it all unfold, his chest rising with a quiet pride he hadn't felt in years. This place was no longer just a dream, it was real, and it carried Anne's name like a promise. That morning, Sophie arrived with two people Edward had never met before. They walked slowly across the courtyard, a warm-looking woman with gentle eyes and a tall man with a weathered face that spoke of a life of steady work. Sophie's voice carried a note of excitement as she called out, "Grandpa, I want you to meet my parents." The word stopped him cold. Grandpa. For the first time, someone had said it to him. He felt his throat tighten, his hands instinctively clenching at his sides. All the pain of Daniel's betrayal, all the loneliness that had weighed on him since Anne passed, it cracked open in that single word. When Sophie's mother wrapped him in a hug, and her father shook his hand with a firm grip, Edward realized he wasn't just gaining a granddaughter. He was being folded into another family that had already given Sophie the love Daniel had denied her. Later, as they toured the center together, Sophie slipped her hand into his and whispered, "I've always wanted to say it out loud. I finally have a grandpa." Edward blinked away the sting in his eyes and managed a smile. "And I finally have a granddaughter," he said softly. That night back home, Edward sat at his desk, exhausted but light-hearted when his email notification chimed. He almost ignored it, but the sender's name froze him, Daniel. His breath caught as he opened it. The message was short, almost clumsy. "Dad, I heard about the center. I'm proud of you." He read the line over and over, his emotions twisted in knots. Pride. From the son who had once tried to poison him. Was it genuine remorse or just another empty gesture? For the first time in months, he didn't know what to feel. He didn't reply, not yet. The question hung in the air like a door left half open. Could forgiveness ever be possible? Or were some wounds too deep to heal? The next evening, Edward sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in strokes of orange and gold. Beyond the fence, he could hear children from the center still laughing, their joy spilling into the neighborhood. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and whispered almost to himself, almost to Anne, "Blood may betray you, but love can be found in the places you least expect." And in that moment, with the echoes of children's laughter filling the air, Edward realized his story wasn't about endings after all. It was about beginnings, new ones he never thought he'd live to see. So now, wherever you're watching this from, your city, your country, your own porch at sunset, I want you to think about the people who raised you, who stood by you, who gave when they had little to give. If you're lucky enough to still have your parents, take 1 second, just one, and tell them thank you. Because sometimes what they need more than money, more than gifts, is the simple respect and love of their children. And if this story moved you, leave a comment below, share it with someone you care about, and tell us where you're watching from. Together, we can turn stories of betrayal into reminders of love, and maybe even into legacies worth leaving behind.